Um, and we're going to have some examples of some of the big ones, and from like an audio context, how maybe in game audio you might use these. And I'm hoping to kind of spur some ideas for how you might be able to use this stuff in your own workflow. A little bit about myself. My name is Mitchell Lucas. I'm a technical audio designer, Pisces, like long walks on the beach. I am a technical audio designer at Epic Games. I've been with Epic Games for just about 2 years now, working on Fortnite. It's been a blast. Previously, I was at Magic Leap working on some mixed reality. I was there for a couple years doing tech audio there. And before that, I was doing some VR development back in the DK2 era. Fun times. During that time between VR and kind of the birth of mixed reality, that kind of workflow was a little challenging at times. So I thought a lot about workflow and how I might be able to improve workflow and spend less time wrestling with the process as much as I could. And then with Fortnite, we have those regular releases, so we have to be, ready for the next release. And there's a lot of moving parts at Epic. Epic's a big place. So a lot of my mind has been on how do I make that workflow more streamlined for me, for anybody else on my team that I could help out at any point. So it's been on my mind a lot, and editor utilities are a great way to help streamline your own workflow for sure. So editor utilities and scripting the editor. So when we talk about scripting the editor, what do we mean by that? So if you think about scripting in general in game development for audio, what do we tend to think about? Well, we probably tend to think about runtime or gameplay scripting. This is what I like to call is this kind of scripting is like player focused. So this is very relevant to gameplay events that the player is experiencing, and I like to think of this as asking the question, how do I tell a story? So this is kind of like, what is our audio doing in the game? How is the player interacting with that audio? And that kind of scripting the game. But what we want to talk about here is editor time scripting. So this is scripting where the focus comes back onto the developer. So we are scripting for ourselves and our workflow. So the question then becomes, how do I get to that storytelling faster? How do I try to avoid all the pitfalls and the repetitive processes that might get me stuck up before I can get to that creative mindset? So, which leads into the question, why is it so important to script the editor? Well, the big one is monotony kills creativity. The more time we spend setting up a project or organizing our files before we actually get into that creative process, maybe the less drive we have to be creative when we finally get to that point. So what we want to do is, the overarching thing here is we want to let computers do the boring stuff. I mean, they're better at it, they're faster at it, they're more reliable, they don't make mistakes. So it's really a win-win situation. We want to get rid of bottlenecks in workflow. So often we accept these bottlenecks and the poor workflow habits when we don't have to. Whether it be because we have a deadline coming up, you don't really think about the workflow necessarily, and really being able to take that step back and look at that workflow and look at your any possible bottlenecks is a skill in itself. It's something that needs to be developed, to be able to take that step back, look at what you're doing, think about, have I been repeating this over the last months, days, whatever it is? Can I get a computer to do this for me? Can I just outsource this to a computer and get right into the creative stuff? And there's also maybe a black box scenario where you're not quite sure of an underlying process, but everybody's just like, that's kind of how we've always done it, so we just keep doing it like that. So that's another perfect example of where editor utilities or automating automating that process might be a good option. So what tools do we use when we think about editor scripting? Well, luckily, just like gameplay scripting or runtime scripting, we can use blueprints. We can get a lot done with just blueprints on the editor scripting side. And of course, benefits of that, it's a familiar language if you know Blueprints at all. And with Blueprints come quick iteration, quick testing. So that's a great thing to have for editor scripting. And if you want to get a little bit more into the weeds here, you can use Python for some editor scripting as well. Python's not intended to be used for gameplay scripting. It's very much intended for editor-side scripting, but it allows you deeper access into maybe some underlying functions, variables that maybe Blueprints doesn't have visibility into. Plus side here, Python can be directly integrated into Blueprints themselves with some handy Blueprint nodes that we have for that. So here are some of the nodes that we have that you can utilize for Python scripting if you want to. These nodes can execute Python scripts and commands directly from Blueprints. It's basically a copy-paste situation there where you put the scripts. You can have custom inputs and outputs on these nodes where you can send custom data, user-defined data into the scripts, and then you can pull out the results from that node, from that whatever ran in that Python script, and then use that in the rest of your Blueprint. And then you can also execute entire Python files if that's what you want. So a lot of power here, but this talk's going to focus on the Blueprint side because you can get a ton done with just Blueprints on editor scripting. There's relevant plugins. If you want to get into editor scripting, you got to make sure that you have your editor scripting utilities plugin enabled. And then if you want to dive into Python scripting, just make sure you have the Python editor script plugin enabled as well. So let's take a look at the utilities that we have available. So there's two major editor utilities. We have scripted actions, which can be scripted actions for assets in the content browser or actors in your level. And then we have editor utility widgets. And we'll kind of go through an example of these three different types and how you might use them. So, scripted actions. At a high level, scripted actions are basically blueprints, and they have events or functions in them that can be called from the editor. And specifically, through a right-click, a context menu, if you right-click one of the assets or an action in the level, a little menu pops up, and you can call specific functions from these blueprints directly there. And then those apply some logic depending on the assets or actors you have selected at the time. And we'll go into some examples of how that works. Okay, so let's take a look at asset actions first. And then, so how to create an asset action in the editor is pretty simple. We have a little category for it there. So if you right-click in the content browser or use that little plus sign down there to create a new asset, you can go up to, and I apologize if you can't read it, but you go up there to Editor Utilities, and then you can pick Editor Utility Blueprint straight from there. And then a little window pops up, and then that's where you can select the parent class, which is Asset Action Utility in this situation. And that's going to create your blueprint, where you can have those functions that you can then call from the editor. So as an example of an asset action, we're going to look at a simple batch rename. So why? Why are we going to do a batch rename? Well, in game audio, of course, we do deal with a lot of assets. It's really just part of the job. So we want a good way to organize those assets as quickly as possible. Naming conventions, of course, can differ. Maybe how you keep your assets on your personal computer versus how maybe the project you're working on has its own naming convention. What this might allow us to do is directly just without creating any extra work on our computer, we can just import these into the editor, run that batch rename, and then suddenly we assign our assets to the naming convention of the project, and we're fine on that side with the organization. Project organization may change over time. Longer you're in projects, maybe at some point organization shifts a little bit and suddenly you find yourself either moving around a bunch of assets, renaming a bunch of assets. Perfect opportunity to automate that process. Kind of not need to be said, but renaming and organizing is boring, so it's unnecessary. We don't need to do it. I don't hope this goes to full screen, but we're going to do a little video of how this might work for a simple batch rename. So we have a few assets in here. Bad naming convention, we don't want that. It's a name bad naming convention, that's how you know. And they're all numbered differently. It's a mess. So what we do is just select them all. We right-click any one of those, and we go up to Scripted Asset Actions. There's our batch rename right there, ready to go. Click it. Modal window pops up. It's got a couple places to input some information. What's the new name? Put in the fantastic new name. And what starting number do we want these assets at? Just pick 1 there. So we can count up from 1 for these assets. Hit OK. And then they're all renamed, organized, ready to go. So simple, much faster than going through and trying to rename them yourselves. And of course, when you start renaming one, it'll just move over to somewhere else, and you start losing track of where your assets are anyway. So perfect example, just let the computer do it, figure it out. All we have to do is give it some vital information. So let's take a look at how that's working under the hood. So we made that blueprint earlier for the asset action. Inside of that blueprint, we've created a function, just called it batch rename there on the left. On the right side there, we have a couple user inputs that we, user-defined inputs we made. One called new names, just a string, and a starting number, which is an integer. One thing you got to make sure to check, and in these blueprints, this should be enabled automatically, I believe. This call an editor, and that's how you call these functions from the editor, just to make sure, just to double check that that's enabled. I think if you make a function, it's automated. It's automatically enabled, but if you do an event, which can also be called from the editor, you'll have to manually set that. And then here's the function in the blueprint itself. Really simple, not doing much here. On the left side, we have the entry point of the function with the batch rename, and that's for that window that popped up when you typed in that new name and the starting number. It comes in here. We have the helper node right here that's called get selected assets, and all this is doing is finding out what assets you have selected in the content browser, and it's spitting that out into an array here. And then we're cycling through each one of those assets and renaming it there at the end. And all this stuff down here is doing is appending the name we put in with that number on the end. And that number is incremented as we're going through these files in the for each loop here. Very straightforward how this is set up. And then you could modify this however you see fit for your own workflow. You could do things like inserting text into a certain location in the file names. You could replace a substring. You could have this look for a substring out of your names and then replace it with some other text. You could do all kinds of stuff really depending on what you need something like this for. So just an example of an asset action, and we can take a look at a scripted action for actors. So an actor action. Creating an actor action is very similar to an asset action. You right-click in the content browser, you come up to Editor Utilities, you pick an Editor Utility blueprint like that, just like the other one. And the parent class here is going to be called Actor Action Utility. And you just pick that, and you've created your blueprint for that. In this situation, let's say we want to log some information. We want to spit out some information to the output log about some ambient sounds in our level, some relevant information that we care about. So log ambient audio data. Why do we want to do that? Well, levels can get pretty large. If you have a giant level and you have a bunch of maybe ambient sounds in there that have been around for a few months, maybe it's difficult to understand maybe what all of those ambient sounds, all their settings that they have. There could be a lot of actors. Ambient sounds themselves have a ton of settings on them. So we just kind of need a way to get that bird's eye view of the relevant information that we're looking for and just spit that out to the output log just so we can get it at a glance, just so we can see if we want to focus on a certain asset in the level to see its state. So let's take a look at this, how this might work. So we see these actors in the level. I just threw some in there and changed the settings on these ambient sounds. So what you want to do is select as many as you want, so just select all of them. You can do that either in the outliner over there or the viewport itself, and then the same with right-clicking on either in the outliner or the viewport. Just right-click one of those, and you'll run that asset or the actor action on all of these. There's the scripted actor actions down there, and we see log ambient audio data. There's no input here. We're just trying to get some information out. And over there in our output log, we're seeing the relevant information for all of those actors. We're just getting like names and like the pitch and volume multiplier for these. And some of them have just a little bit extra information, inner radius and roll off, this one right here, depending on some things we're looking for in the blueprint, which we can take a look at. So we'll see what's happening under the hood for this one. So very much like the asset action. We're creating a function. We're calling this one log ambient audio data. On the right side, no inputs. And in this specific situation, just trying to get some information out of these actors. There on the local variables, though, we just have a couple things we're keeping references to just to make our blueprint a little less spaghetti. If we can do that, it's always a good thing. And just to double check, call an editor's check. That's always good to look at. Okay, so here's one part of the blueprint. That's just at the beginning. Here's the entry point. No data is coming in. We're just firing this off, a fire and forget kind of a situation. We see here get selection set. It's a little different than the last at the asset action, but this get selection set's the same kind of functionality. It's going to spit out an array of the actors in the level, and then we're going to cycle through each one of those with a for each loop, and we're getting those objects out. We're just going to cast ambient sound just to make sure we have the right type of actor, and we can assume it and get the right information out of it. And then here we're assigning those cached variables here, just so, again, we keep that blueprint as clean as possible. Next section over, just some formatting here. Most of this is going to be to make it a little more readable in the output log. But we're just printing out some information like the name of the ambient sound, the name of the sound that the audio component is using, and then the volume and pitch multiplier for the component, just to get that information as an example and getting some information. The last section here is where we're applying some logic to get extra information from a few of these actors, depending on, as we see it right up there, if we're overriding the attenuation on an asset or one of these actors, then we'll print out just a little more information. We're going to print out what's the inner radius and what's the fall off, and it's just kind of showing you can put some blueprint logic in these things and really make them your own. And again, this one you can expand upon however you want. You can put in you can have some user-defined inputs on this one if you wanted to do that, to further maybe filter what you're looking for, maybe set some parameters for what you're wanting to return. You could introduce maybe some data assets to this. Maybe you want, instead of to print out to the output log, maybe you want that information to go into a data asset or something. You could do that if you wanted to. You could have an input for a data asset. Maybe you have information that you want to assign to these actors from a data asset. You could do that. You could read through the data asset and then apply those new settings to the actors in the level. Again, a ton of things you can do with this. Really, sky's the limit and based on your needs. Now let's look at editor utility widgets. So this gets a little cooler here with the possibilities. Editor utility widgets are basically like blueprint widgets, like you would see in game, like with the health bar or whatever it is that you would see on the screen. But editor utility widgets are widgets that are dockable in the editor. So you could dock this as on one side of the editor and have that widget work while you're working. It could have buttons and knobs that actually affect things in the editor. Or in Pi, if you're playing in the editor, you can use that in that situation as well. So let's take a look at this. On how to create one of those. Even simpler. Right click, you go up to editor utilities here, and you just select editor utility widget, and you got your blueprint. Fantastic. Okay, so for editor utility widget, let's do some submix metering. So submix metering, why do we want to do that? Well, it's always handy to have visual aid while you're working. I mean, why not? Maybe seeing spectral analysis data for the sounds in your game. You can see frequency buildup. Maybe you didn't know was there. Maybe in the deep, the low end of your frequency data. Multi-channel monitoring for if 5.1, 7.1, you can quickly see at a glance the volumes of your different channels. which helps, of course, if you have, as you're playing your game, for positional audio to help you debug and understand, where the sounds are in your game as you're playing. Just visual information is good to have, and of course, why not? It looks cool. It's awesome. So we'll take a look at how this looks in action as well. So in this situation, playing sounds in the content browser, you can see in this situation it's stereo. You can see the channel data, volume data, frequency, spectral analysis there. Not only that, you can go from auditioning these sounds in the editor to straight playing the game in Pi, and game audio is coming through that, and then you can audition that live. Yeah, just a good way to get some visual feedback with the audio. And the great thing about auditioning the submixes as well is we're auditioning the master submix, but we could change that. We could go to maybe just the reverb and just audition everything going through reverb submix, or you want to change to music, and just do the music. Pretty cool to have. And the setup's not that difficult. Actually, I'll have a link to our snippets repository, so you can, right now it's up on the snippets repository, so you can copy it into your project and try it out. But we'll look at it here and kind of go over what's going on. So being a widget blueprint, it's going to have two parts to it. So one's the blueprint graph, and then one's the designer tab, which of course is the tab that houses all the UI elements, and this is where you set up how the widget's going to look. And that's what this is. This is the designer side, and there's really only 3 elements right here. The top there, an object property, that's for where you're assigning the submix that you're wanting to analyze, and then we have 2 audio meter widgets. Thanks to the Audio Engine team, they created these, so we just piggyback off of these. We don't do much. They're already there for us. We can pick how many meters we have in those widgets, how big the meters are. We have some scaling options right here. A lot of options here. Fantastic widgets, and most of the work for us. Before this, I was using progress bars, and it was a nightmare. So looking at the blueprint here, it gets a little more complicated, but the gist of it is pretty simple. Right here, we're just subscribing. We're creating some delegates for envelope following for the submix, spectral analysis, setting the properties for this, how many bands we want, stuff like that, and those are going to fire off in custom events that we created in this blueprint. And those custom events will fire into this function, and all this function is doing is taking in the array of volumes, whether it's the bands in the spectral analysis or the channel information, and just feeding the respective meters. And the value that comes through is a 0, 1, but we're doing a little bit, just these 2 nodes right here are just going to do some conversion to decibels, just so it's a little easier to read. Yeah, it's not much setup. It's just trying to account for things like whether you're auditioning sounds in the editor, which has its own kind of world reference, and then going into Pi, which has its more in-game reference, and making that transition. And this does that. So, like I said, I'll have a link. I think it's on the last slide that will. You can check out the snippets repository and find it there. I think it's called Audio Meter Widgets. But yeah, I'll reference that again at the end. So. Other possibilities for editor utility widgets and editor utility asset actions and actor actions. Animations, animation assets. There's a lot of stuff you can access in animation assets. You could automate, maybe Play Sound Notifies. You could automate changing the sound that Play Sound Notifies plays in a bunch of assets. You could add notifies, you could remove notifies, you can move notifies, you could add tracks, all kinds of stuff. Same with sequencer. We could automate a lot of stuff with that too. Asset creation, of course. If you find yourself repeatedly creating assets as part of your workflow, definitely can automate that as well. Highly recommend doing that. Third-party pipelines. If you work with third-party programs, you could definitely come up with a workflow with these editor utilities to integrate directly with third-party programs, as long as it's not audio. because you don't need that. We got the engine. Engine audio is great. And game parameter visualization. So visualizing how game parameters might drive audio. That's a great way with some widgets there to visualize some game parameters that are going on. Countless more. Really this depends. And like I said before, it's really a skill that you have to develop in order to understand where your bottlenecks are, where your visibility is at a loss, and to think about how these tools might be able to help you in your specific workflow. And again, this is very specific to what you might need. I mean, we're constantly trying to improve the engine, but we can't account for everybody's needs. So that's why these tools are here. Until we can solve all of the problems that everybody's going to have, these tools are here for you to utilize to make those changes as quickly as possible. And of course, if you make something cool, share it. Give us that feedback too. That kind of stuff goes a long way to getting the Unreal Engine itself better for everybody. That's what we're here for. Maybe a couple of the same. Okay, so here's some helpful links. There is the snippets repository. It's the generic, the front page snippets repository here. Highly recommend, if you don't know what this is, check it out. There's a lot of really cool stuff from both the community, some official stuff from Epic also. Great resource. There's some great tools on there. And scripting the editor using blueprints. We want to get brushed up on some blueprint workflow. And of course, UMG for widget, for working with widgets. So get brushed up with some UMG. Anybody else is still trying to get some information out here. But yeah, this will be online too, I believe. So that's it. So here, and then here's the, if you want that audio meter widget, that stuff's on there. It should just be a few things to copy and paste over from the snippets, and you should be up and running. Make some cool stuff with that for sure. And I want to see some cool stuff. Like it's awesome to see people creating some stuff, and these really help us out. As in-game audio, just to make some cool things and automate some cool processes. So, yeah, I think probably have plenty of time for some questions. So, thank you everybody.